So I was in a bookstore, this is several months ago now, and I stumbled across a graphic novel entitled Judas. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with that phrase, graphic novel, this was a series of comic books about Judas that was put into one book together, a collection that tells a story about Judas. It is written by a man named Jeff Loveness. And I read the foreword of it, of how it came about, and he said he's a writer. He writes for the Emmys, the Oscars, The Onion, the Jimmy Kimmel Live show, and for Marvel Comics. And he said he had made a list of things, the ideas he had for writing, and at the very bottom of that list was the idea of writing a graphic novel about Judas. And sure enough, he met with the execs at Boom Comics, and the thing on the very last of his list is what they wanted him to write a story on. Isn't it interesting? One who probably writes jokes for all these shows, the thing they were interested in was about Judas. And in the story, in the book, I've read it a couple of times now, it recaps a lot of our biblical narratives that we know about Judas, but then he takes some creative liberties to answer these questions why that you were asking in your anthem. And the setting for the middle of this comic is actually hell. And I think in that phrase that we say in the Apostles' Creed, descended into hell, Jesus descended into hell, it is a scene where Jesus meets Judas again in hell. And in a creative moment, thinking about this story that maybe Judas' betrayal was a part of a larger cosmic plan, what the writer does is Jesus actually seeks Judas' forgiveness in the pit of hell for being set up to be a part of this drama. And once Judas offers forgiveness, Jesus then ascends out of hell to do Jesus' creative work of salvation. Now, I realize I share that, and some of our more orthodox friends may say, wow, that's pretty darn heretical. But I will tell you what won me over in reading this was the fact that this writer, I have no idea about his religious background or his Christian background, was somehow wrestling with why Judas did what he did. And in a creative way, he tried to answer that question with this interaction between Jesus and Judas in hell. And I love that. I love that someone who writes for comedy shows and award shows also has the depth to wrestle with some of the deepest questions that we have about one of our biblical characters that's shrouded in mystery. Isn't that wonderful? Isn't that a reminder, whether he's right or wrong, heretical or not, that we are all called to these places of wonder in the midst of mystery? In the three lists in the Gospels that we have of the disciples, Judas Iscariot is introduced like this. Judas Iscariot, the one who betrayed Jesus. Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him. Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor. The question is why? Why did Judas do it? What happened in his relationship with Jesus? In his relationship with this Jesus movement, this movement of God that changed things. I invite you to look at the image on the cover of your bulletin. It's a Caravaggio. I actually think Patty Shaver, our administrative assistant, had a hard time finding a good copy of the original, so I think it's actually a copy of it. The original is in the National Museum of Art in Dublin. And interestingly enough, it went missing for about 200 years. And they discovered it in the Society of Jesus, a Jesuit community in Dublin. It was hanging in their dining hall. And after some cleaning up of the painting, they realized it was the original. And now it hangs in that museum in Dublin, if you ever travel over there. But it's so interesting to look at the face of Jesus and his, what appears to be moving backwards. You see an arm of a soldier and you wonder if he's being pushed backwards or if he is resisting Judas's kiss as Judas moves forward. And as you look at their faces, you wonder what is behind that relationship and how it reached this point. Well, unlike the disciple Peter, who we talked about last week, who has 155 mentions in the New Testament, Judas has all of 22 verses. And there are mainly 4 or 5 stories that these 22 verses enter into. The first story where we really get a picture of Judas is the woman who has the alabaster jar of ointment, who pours the ointment on Jesus or wipes Jesus' feet with her hair. And in most of the Gospels, it says the disciples disagreed with this use of that ointment, that it was expensive ointment and could have been sold and given to the poor. But in the Gospel of John, they explicitly mention Judas as the one who disagrees with this action. And Jesus says to Judas, "Leave her alone. She is doing what is good, what is meant to be done in preparation for my burial." And in several of the Gospels after this story, it is then that Judas goes off to the chief priests to begin to plot about how to turn him over. And in one of those stories, in the Gospel of Matthew, he is actually given 30 pieces of silver right on the spot to execute this plan. The second story that we see Judas a lot in is in the Last Supper. Again, in most of the Gospels, Jesus highlights that one will betray him, and that person is not named. We believe it to be Judas. But again, in the Gospel of John, Judas is named. And often we think about Judas grabbing the bread and dipping it into the wine and partaking of it, and that's how he is known. And indeed, in one of the Gospels, it says that's what the betrayer will do. But in the Gospel of John, Jesus actually takes the bread, Jesus dips it in the wine, and gives it to the one who will betray him. He gives it to Judas, and then says to Judas, "Go and do what you will do." And the scriptures say that the disciples were confused. They didn't know if he was going to run an errand for the Passover festival. They didn't know if he was going to do something for the poor. But he leaves the room and goes out into the night. The third story that we are very familiar with is the story of the Garden of Gethsemane. And that is where Judas brings the cohorts, the soldiers, and in 3 out of 4 of the stories, Judas either attempts to kiss Jesus or does kiss Jesus as a sign that he is the one that the soldiers are to take away. And then the final story, which really could be story 4 and story 5, but we have blended them together through the years, especially since we haven't necessarily read these stories carefully, and we often blend the stories of the gospel together, is about Judas' end, about how he died. Well, in one of the Gospels, the Gospel of Matthew, he's received those 30 coins. And we are told that he actually realizes that he has set up an innocent man, and he brings those coins back to the temple to try to return them to the chief priest, and it says he repented. But the chief priest would not take the money back. And so we're told that Judas scatters the 30 coins or drops them in the temple and leaves and hangs himself. And the temple authorities took the coins, and what we are told they did with them was they bought a field where those who are from different countries, if they died while they were in Jerusalem, they could be buried in that land. The other story that we have is in the Acts of the Apostles, and we are told with the money that Judas did go buy a field himself, and that he went out to that field, and when he was there, he fell over, in almost a mystical and bizarre or horrific scene. He fell over, and then when he fell over, his innards opened up, and he died right there in the field. In both cases, the field is called the field of blood. And the question is, why is it called a field of blood? Is it called a field of blood because the chief priest purchased a field with blood money? Or is it a field of blood because Judas' own blood spilled in that place? And he died there, and that is why it's called the field of blood. So those are the stories that we have of Judas biblically. It's interesting that our English Bible translates the Greek word betray as betray. Because really, as I read about this, and remember, every time Judas' name is mentioned, he is often described as the one who betrays Jesus. It's interesting that it is translated with this word because every commentary I read said that's not really the best translation. The best translation is that he was turned over. And you might say, well, Mac, what's the difference? But I don't know about you, but as I read the word betray, it has a much greater seriousness to it than the phrase turned over. So hang on to that for a moment, and I'm going to return to that. It appears clear in the Gospel of Mark that the reason why Judas may have gone to the chief priest was he was upset. He had reached the end of his rope when the event with the woman spilling the ointment, the perfume on Jesus happened. That he was upset about the use of that ointment. That's what's clear in the Gospel of Mark. In the Gospel of Matthew, it appears that Jesus is motivated by money. He gets those 30 pieces of silver. He's concerned that that ointment should have been sold for money. And we hear bits and pieces about him being the treasurer of the disciples. But we hit a whole different level when we get to the Gospel of Luke and the Gospel of John. In the Gospel of Luke, at the Passover supper, at the Last Supper, we are told at a certain point that Satan, the adversary, enters into Judas and that his actions of turning over happen after that. And in the Gospel of John, that author takes it a step further. When he's at the Passover dinner, we are told that Satan enters in to Judas, and then a few verses later, we are told that the devil enters into him. And you kind of are wondering, what is this is there an adversary and then a devil? Is Satan entering into him twice? So there's almost this cosmic view. But as I studied scholars and what they thought that Judas' change could be for a variety of other reasons. Judas, they say, may have been so disenchanted with the way that Jesus' ministry was playing out that that's when he began to turn. That Jesus was not being the Messiah that he thought, that Judas thought he was called to be. The other thought is that Judas might have turned, or Jesus might have turned Judas over so that he would be forced to have face-to-face interactions with the ones that he had been arguing with and having disagreements with. And so Judas was trying to get the chief priests and Jesus in the same room so that they could have actual dialogue about the vision of what God is calling them to do. And other scholars felt like Judas may have done this. It turned him over to the chief priests so that there could be a confrontation with the occupying Romans, that they would see Jesus as a political Messiah who could face the oppressors. And so I come back to that phrase, betray or turn over to. And when you hear those last three reasons that I give, it might become clear that Judas was turning him over so that some of these interactions could happen. Judas almost trying to force the change that he hoped for and he desired. All of these are possible. And like the choir was singing, asking questions there, these stories are veiled in mystery. How much was controlled by God? How much was controlled by Christ? How much freedom was in this? And Judas moving as he saw or he felt led to. But what I believe about this story is more what I see throughout human history. That we love a scapegoat. We love when someone comes forward as the betrayer, so that we can point our finger at that one and say, well, he did it. He did it. I wasn't involved in all. It was him. But all you have to do is go to the story in Matthew that I read to realize that the drama, the events that occurred with Judas are just one stone in a long series of stepping stones that lead Jesus to the cross. In the story that I read, Jesus says, I have been in the temple day after day, and you have not arrested me. He's been there. He's been public, and they didn't come. And then after that moment, what do the disciples do? They scatter. They leave him. They flee. There were so many steps along the way where Jesus moved towards the cross. It was not simply Judas's actions. It is communal actions. It is a variety of things that the community did to betray him, and Judas has become the scapegoat. I have one other theory as I think about people who have proclaimed the love of Christ. And that is, when we experience beauty, when we look in the face of beauty, we have two reactions. Sometimes we want to drop everything and embrace that beauty. Let go of everything, let go of our faulty ways and move closer to it. But sometimes we are so overcome with beauty that we can't stand it, that we want to get rid of it. We want to kill beauty because we can't face our own faultiness. And in many ways, that's what I think happened to Christ communally. And so the question for us today as disciples of Christ is, when we are faced with the beauty of Christ, will we drop everything, drop our agenda, and embrace that beauty? Or will we kill beauty because it's too much for us to face? My hope and the good news of the gospel is that we will remember our humility that God gives us so that we might embrace the beauty. Amen.